It is early April in the year 1453. The air above Constantinople carries the salt of 3 seas. The city sits on its peninsula like a crown that has slipped slightly, still beautiful, still proud, but worn by 11 centuries of weight. The walls that ring the city are older than most kingdoms. They have seen armies come and go. They have outlasted emperors, plagues, and the slow erosion of time itself. Inside those walls, perhaps 60,000 people go about their lives. Bakers knead bread in the pre-dawn darkness. Their hands are white with flour. The ovens glow orange in the dim streets. Fishermen mend nets along the Golden Horn, their fingers working by memory, pulling thread through holes worn by use and salt water. Priests light candles in churches whose domes catch the first pale light. The wax smells sweet. The smoke rises in thin lines toward painted saints who have watched over this city for generations. The city smells of wood smoke and fish, of incense and stone, dust. It sounds like any other spring morning. Footsteps on cobblestones worn smooth by 1,000 years of walking, the cry of gulls wheeling over the harbor, the distant ring of a hammer on metal in a blacksmith's shop. Somewhere a dog barks. Somewhere a mother calls her child inside. The great chain across the Golden Horn creaks slightly with the movement of the tide. But something has changed. To the west, beyond the land walls, the horizon is no longer empty. Tents have appeared, thousands of them. They spread across the fields like a second city, one made of canvas and purpose. Campfires dot the landscape at night, small points of light that mirror the stars. By day, the movement of men and horses raises dust that hangs in the air like a question no one wants to answer. The Ottoman army has arrived. For weeks, the people of Constantinople have known this moment was coming. Messengers brought word of the Sultan's march. Scouts reported the size of his force. Merchants who fled the countryside spoke of roads filled with soldiers, of supply trains stretching for miles, of cannon being dragged slowly toward the city on massive wooden carriages. But knowing and seeing are different things. Now the siege is real. Now the waiting begins. If you're listening to this tonight, welcome to Archive of Rest. I'm glad you're here. Over the next few hours, we're going to walk through history together. Slowly, carefully, one day at a time. We're going to spend 53 days inside the walls of Constantinople, watching as an empire reaches its final chapter. This isn't a story of heroes and villains. It's a story of people facing something larger than themselves, doing what they can with what they have. If you enjoy this kind of calm, immersive history, consider subscribing. There's more like this waiting for you. The Siege of Constantinople lasted from April 6th to May 29th, 1453. 53 days. Not a long siege by medieval standards, but long, enough for hope to fade and return and fade again. Long enough for the people inside to wonder if help would come. Long enough for the stones of the walls to crack under the weight of cannon fire. Long enough for children to grow used to the sound of distant drums. This is not a story with a happy ending. You probably know how it ends. Constantinople falls. The Byzantine Empire, which has stood for over 1,000 years, comes to a close. But the ending is not the only part that matters. What matters is how people lived through those days, what they felt, what they chose, how they kept going when the outcome seemed certain. The city they are defending is not what it once was. Constantinople in 1453 is a shadow of its former self. There are neighborhoods inside the walls where no one lives anymore. Houses stand empty. Gardens have gone wild. Entire districts are silent except for the wind moving through broken shutters. The population has shrunk over the centuries. Wars, plagues, and economic decline have taken their toll. But the walls remain. The churches remain. The memory of what this city once was remains, and that memory matters. Constantinople is not just a city. It is the last living connection to the Roman Empire. When people here speak of the empire, they do not mean something that ended 1,000 years ago. They mean themselves. They are Romans. Their emperor, Constantine XI, is a Roman emperor. The fact that they speak Greek, that their culture has changed and adapted over centuries, does not change this identity. They carry the weight of Rome on their shoulders. The walls that protect them are a marvel. 3 lines of defense run along the western edge of the city, where the land is vulnerable. The outer wall is low, meant to slow attackers. Behind it lies a terrace, then a higher inner wall with towers that rise like stone fingers pointing at the sky. Behind that, a final massive wall, thick enough that men can walk along its top, high enough that ladders seem like toys against it. These walls have never been breached by force. They have stood for 1,000 years. They have turned back armies that seemed unstoppable. But this time is different. This time the Ottomans have brought something new. Cannon. Not small cannon, but massive bronze tubes that can throw stone balls weighing half a ton. No one knows if the walls can withstand this kind of punishment. No one has ever tried. We're going to move through this siege day by day, sometimes week by week. We'll stand on the walls with the defenders. We'll walk the streets as the food runs low. We'll listen to the prayers in the Hagia Sophia and the commands in the Ottoman camp. We'll watch the cannons fire and the walls crack and the sea fill with ships. We'll meet the people who lived through this. The emperor who knew he was likely facing his death. The sultan who was 21 years old and determined to succeed where his predecessors had failed. The soldiers on both sides who were just trying to survive. And we'll do it all quietly. There's no need to rush. History has already happened. The urgency is gone. What remains is the story, and the story deserves to be told with care. So, settle in. Let the day fall away. Close your eyes if you want. We're going back 573 years to a city on the edge of the world, in the final spring of its long life. The sun is rising over the Bosphorus. The walls are casting long shadows. The bells are ringing for morning prayer. Constantinople is waiting. The city has been preparing for months. Not frantically, not with panic, but with the steady, deliberate movements of people who know what is coming and have decided to face it. By early April 1453, Constantinople has done what it can. The walls have been inspected. Weak sections have been reinforced with timber and rubble. The gates have been checked and rechecked. Supplies have been gathered. Grain, salted fish, wine, oil for lamps. Not enough, perhaps, but what could be found. The population is smaller than it should be. Many left when the rumors of war became certainties. Merchants packed their goods and sailed away. Families with means found reasons to visit relatives in other cities. The Genoese and Venetian traders who have lived here for generations debated among themselves. Some stayed, some left. The ones who remained did so knowing the risk. What's left is a core of people who have nowhere else to go, or who have decided that this city is worth defending. 60,000, perhaps. Maybe fewer. No one has counted recently. The city that once held 500,000 now feels hollow in places. You can walk through entire neighborhoods and hear only your own footsteps. But in other parts, life continues with a strange normalcy. The markets still open, though the goods are fewer. The taverns still serve wine, though the conversations are quieter. Children still play in the streets, though their mothers call them inside earlier than they used to. People adapt. They always do. The emperor is Constantine XI Palaiologos. He is 48 years old. He has been emperor for 4 years, though the title means less than it once did. The Byzantine Empire, which once stretched from Spain to Syria, now consists of this city and a few scattered territories. Constantine rules over walls and memories. But he takes the responsibility seriously. He is not a warrior emperor in the old style. He is a practical man, a diplomat who has spent his life trying to hold together something that wants to fall apart. He knows the odds. He has sent letters begging for help from the Christian powers of Europe. Some have sent token forces. Most have sent nothing. The Pope promised aid in exchange for the reunification of the Eastern and Orthodox churches. Constantine agreed, though the decision split his own people. Many in Constantinople would rather fall to the Ottomans than submit to Rome. The emperor walks the walls most days. He inspects the defenses. He talks to the soldiers. He tries to project confidence he may not feel. The men respect him for this. He could have fled. He could have negotiated a safe passage for himself. Instead, he is here, standing on the walls with them, looking out at the Ottoman camp. The military commander is Giovanni Giustiniani. He is a Genoese soldier, a professional, a man who has fought in wars across the Mediterranean. He arrived in January with 700 men and a reputation for defending impossible positions. Constantine gave him command of the land walls, the most critical section of the defense. It was a practical choice. Giustiniani knows siege warfare. He knows how to organize men, how to ration supplies, how to keep morale from collapsing. The two men work well together. Constantine provides the authority. Giustiniani provides the expertise. Between them, they have organized the defense as best they can. The walls have been divided into sections. Each section has a commander. Each commander knows his men and his stretch of wall. The Genoese hold the most vulnerable points. The Venetians hold the sea walls. The Greek citizens and soldiers fill in the gaps. There are perhaps 7,000 fighting men in the city. Maybe 8,000 if you count everyone who can hold a weapon. Against them, the Ottoman army numbers somewhere between 80,000 and 150,000. The exact number is unclear. Estimates vary, but the disparity is obvious to anyone who looks out. From the walls, the defenders have one advantage: the walls. 3 lines of stone and mortar that have never been breached. The outer wall is low, perhaps 20 feet high, with a ditch in front of it. Behind it, a terrace 40 feet wide. Then the inner wall, 40 feet high, with 96 towers spaced along its length. Each tower is a fortress in miniature. Each can be defended independently if the wall is breached. The walls run for 4 miles along the western edge of the city, from the Sea of Marmara in the south to the Golden Horn in the north. The sea walls are lower, less formidable, but the sea itself is a defense. Ships cannot easily approach the steep shores, and the Golden Horn is protected by a massive chain stretched across its mouth, preventing enemy ships from entering the harbor. The chain is one of the city's most important defenses. It is made of iron links, each as thick as a man's arm. It floats on wooden pontoons and can be raised or lowered by a mechanism on the shore. With the chain in place, the Ottoman fleet cannot enter the Golden Horn. The Byzantine and Allied ships can shelter there safely. It is a small advantage, but in a siege, small advantages matter. The mood in the city is hard to describe. It is not quite fear, not quite resignation. It is something in between. People go about their work with a kind of determined calm. They know what is coming. They have known for weeks. The waiting is almost a relief. At least now it will begin. At least now they will know. In the churches, the priests lead prayers. The Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral at the heart of the city, is filled every day. People come to light candles, to kneel before icons, to ask for protection. The building is over 900 years old. Its dome seems to float above the nave, held up by light and faith. The mosaics on the walls glow in the candlelight. Christ, Mary, the saints, all watching with calm faces. There is tension over religion. The emperor's agreement with the Pope has not been forgotten. Many Orthodox Christians see it as a betrayal. They believe that union with Rome is worse than conquest by the Ottomans. At least the Ottomans are honest enemies. Rome, they say, wants to swallow their church, to erase their traditions. There are arguments in the streets. Some priests refuse to acknowledge the union. Some citizens refuse to attend services where it is mentioned. But when the cannons start firing, these arguments will seem smaller. When the walls begin to crack, theology will matter less than survival. For now, though, the divisions remain. They are part of the fabric of the city, as much as the stones and the sea. The food situation is manageable, but not comfortable. The granaries hold enough for a few months if rationing is strict. The cisterns are full of water. The city has always been good at storing water. Beneath the streets, vast underground chambers hold reserves that could last a year. But food is different. Food runs out, and there is no way to bring more in once the siege begins. Some people have hoarded supplies. The wealthy have stocked their cellars. The poor make do with what they can find. There is already a black market for grain and oil. Prices have risen. They will rise more. On the evening of April 5th, the city is as ready as it will ever be. The sun sets over the land walls, casting long shadows across the Ottoman camp. Smoke from thousands of campfires rises into the sky. The sound of drums carries on the wind. Inside the city, the bells ring for evening prayer. People gather in their homes. They eat dinner. They talk quietly. They try not to think too much about tomorrow. Tomorrow, the siege begins. The man who has come to conquer Constantinople is 21 years old. Mehmed II became Sultan in 1451, when his father abdicated for the second time. It was not Mehmed's first time on the throne. He had ruled briefly as a child, a puppet controlled by advisors while his father retired. That experience taught him about power and how easily it can be taken away. When he returned to rule at 19, he was determined to be no one's puppet. He is intelligent, well-educated, and ambitious in a way that makes older men nervous. He speaks several languages: Turkish, Arabic, Greek, Persian, Latin. He reads history and philosophy. He studies maps and siege tactics. He has been thinking about Constantinople since he was a boy. His tutors told him stories of previous sultans who tried to take the city and failed. His father tried twice. Both times the walls held. Mehmed has decided he will succeed where others failed. Not through luck or divine favor, but through preparation and overwhelming force. He has spent 2 years getting ready for this moment. 2 years gathering resources, building weapons, training men, and planning every detail of the siege. The first thing he did was secure his position. He eliminated potential rivals. He made alliances with powers that might interfere. He signed a treaty with Hungary to keep them neutral. He made peace with Venice, at least temporarily. He wanted no distractions when the time came to move against Constantinople. Then he began to build. The Ottomans already controlled both sides of the Bosphorus, the narrow strait that connects the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara. But Mehmed wanted to control it completely. In 1452, he built a fortress on the European side, directly across from an older fortress on the Asian side. The new fortress, Rumeli Hisari, went up in just 4 months. It has 3 main towers and walls thick enough to mount cannon. Its purpose is simple: to cut off Constantinople from any help that might come from the Black Sea. The Byzantines protested. They sent envoys. Mehmed ignored them. When the fortress was complete, he placed cannon in the towers and began stopping ships that tried to pass. Any ship that refused to stop was sunk. Constantinople was now isolated from the north. But the fortress was just the beginning. Mehmed's real innovation was the cannon. He understood that the walls of Constantinople had never been breached because no one had ever brought enough force to bear against them. Siege towers could be burned. Battering rams could be dropped on from above. Ladders could be pushed away. But cannon could break stone. He hired a Hungarian engineer named Urban. Urban had offered his services to Constantine first, but the Byzantine Emperor could not afford to pay him. So Urban went to Mehmed, who could. Mehmed asked him if he could build a cannon large enough to destroy the walls of Constantinople. Urban said yes. The result was a monster. The cannon Urban built was 27 feet long. It weighed nearly 20 tons. It could fire a stone ball weighing over 1,200 pounds. The ball could travel a mile. When it hit stone, it shattered both the ball and the wall. Nothing like it had ever been built before. The cannon was cast in Adrianople, the Ottoman capital, over 3 months in the winter of 1452. When it was finished, it took 60 oxen and 200 men to move it. The journey to Constantinople took 2 months. The roads had to be reinforced. Bridges had to be rebuilt to support the weight. The cannon moved at a pace of 2 miles per day. Mehmed had other cannon as well. Smaller ones, but still formidable. He had mortars that could lob stones over walls. He had bombards that could fire at close range. In total, he brought perhaps 70 cannon to the siege. The exact number is unclear, but the intent was obvious. He meant to pound the walls into rubble. The army he assembled was equally impressive. Estimates vary wildly, but most historians agree on a number between 80,000 and 150,000 men. The core of the force was the Janissaries, the elite infantry of the Ottoman army. They were slave soldiers, taken as boys from Christian families, converted to Islam, and trained from childhood to fight. They were disciplined, loyal, and effective. Mehmed had about 12,000 of them. Beyond the Janissaries, there were regular infantry, cavalry, engineers, miners, and support troops. There were soldiers from across the Ottoman Empire, Turks, Arabs, Serbs, Greeks who had already submitted to Ottoman rule. There were volunteers drawn by the promise of plunder. There were mercenaries. It was a massive, diverse force, but it was well organized. Mehmed had spent months drilling them, preparing them for this campaign. The fleet was equally important. Mehmed gathered over 300 ships. Some were warships, galleys with oars and rams. Others were transport ships, carrying supplies and troops. The fleet's job was to blockade the city from the sea, to prevent any relief force from arriving by water, and to support the land assault if possible. The Ottomans also brought siege equipment beyond the cannon. They had towers on wheels that could be pushed up to the walls. They had ladders, grappling hooks, and battering rams. They had materials for building ramps and filling in ditches. They had everything they needed for a prolonged siege. But Mehmed did not want a prolonged siege. He wanted to take the city quickly, before European powers could organize a relief force. Speed and overwhelming force. That was his strategy. He also understood psychology. He knew that the defenders were outnumbered and isolated. He knew that every day of bombardment would wear down their morale. He knew that the sight of his massive army camped outside the walls would make them feel small and alone. Fear was a weapon, and he intended to use it. On April 2nd, Mehmed arrived at the walls with the main body of his army. He set up his command tent directly opposite the weakest section of the walls, a stretch known as the Mesotaikion, the middle wall. This was where the land dipped slightly, where the walls were a bit lower, where previous earthquakes had caused damage that had been repaired, but never quite restored to full strength. This was where Mehmed would focus his attack. He positioned his best troops there. The Janissaries would assault that section. The great cannon would fire at that section. Everything would be concentrated on breaking through at that one point. The rest of his army spread out along the entire length of the land walls, from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn. This served two purposes. It prevented the defenders from concentrating their forces, and it kept them spread thin. Every section of wall had to be defended because any section might be attacked. Mehmed also sent troops to the far side of the Golden Horn, to the district of Galata, where the Genoese had a colony. The Genoese claimed neutrality, but Mehmed did not trust them. He wanted troops nearby to watch them, and to prevent any surprise attack from that direction. By April 5th, everything was in place. The army was positioned. The cannon were being moved into place. The fleet was in the Sea of Marmara, ready to blockade the city. Supplies were stocked. The men were rested and ready. Mehmed held a council with his commanders. He told them that Constantinople would fall. He told them that they would be the ones to accomplish what generations of warriors had failed to do. He promised them glory and plunder. He reminded them that the prophet himself had praised the army that would take this city. Then he gave the order. The siege would begin at dawn on April 6th. That night, the Ottoman camp was quiet. The men checked their weapons. They sharpened swords and tested bowstrings. They prayed. They thought about what the next days would bring. Some were eager. Some were nervous. All of them knew they were part of something historic. In his tent, Mehmed reviewed maps and plans one more time. He was confident but not complacent. He knew the walls were formidable. He knew the defenders would fight hard, but he also knew he had prepared better than anyone before him. He had the weapons, the men, and the will to see this through. Tomorrow, the cannons would speak. The first cannon fired at dawn on April 6th. The sound was unlike anything most people in Constantinople had ever heard. It was not the sharp crack of a crossbow or the thud of a catapult. It was a deep, rolling boom that seemed to come from the earth itself. The ground shook. Birds rose from the walls in clouds. People in their homes felt the vibration through the floors. Then came the impact. The stone ball hit the outer wall near the gate of St. Romanus. Dust and fragments of stone exploded outward. The wall held, but a crack appeared, running up from the point of impact like a lightning bolt frozen in stone. The defenders on the walls stood silent for a moment, processing what they had just witnessed. Then they went to work. This was what they had prepared for. This was what they knew was coming. The first days of the siege fell into a pattern that would repeat for weeks. The Ottomans would bombard the walls during the day. The defenders would repair the damage at night. And it was a race between destruction and restoration, between the power of gunpowder and the determination of men with shovels and timber. The great cannon could only fire 7 times a day. It took 3 hours to cool, clean, and reload after each shot. The process was delicate. The barrel grew so hot that water poured on it turned instantly to steam. The recoil was tremendous. After each shot, the cannon had to be repositioned. The crew worked carefully, knowing that a mistake could cause the barrel to explode, killing everyone nearby. But 7 shots a day was enough. Each ball that hit the wall did damage. Sometimes it was minor, a few stones knocked loose, a crack that could be easily patched. Sometimes it was significant. A section of wall weakened, a tower damaged, a breach that required hours of work to fill. The smaller cannon fired more frequently. They were positioned all along the line, targeting different sections of wall. The bombardment was constant, from dawn until dusk. The air was filled with the sound of cannon fire, the crash of stone on stone, the shouts of men, and the ringing of bells from the city's churches. Inside Constantinople, people adapted to the noise. They learned to tell the different sounds apart: the deep boom of the great cannon, the sharper crack of the smaller guns, the whistle of a stone ball passing overhead, the impact. After a few days, these sounds became part of the background, like the wind or the sea. But the psychological effect was real. The constant bombardment wore on people's nerves. Sleep became difficult. Children cried at the sudden noises. Even those who tried to maintain normal routines found themselves flinching at unexpected sounds. The defenders worked in shifts. During the day, men stood on the walls watching for any sign of an assault. Archers and crossbowmen were positioned at intervals. Small cannon, much smaller than the Ottoman guns, were placed on the towers. They could not match the range or power of the Ottoman artillery, but they could harass the enemy crews and make their work more dangerous. At night, the real work began. As soon as darkness fell, teams of workers emerged from the city. They carried timber, barrels of earth and rubble, tools. They worked by torchlight, filling in breaches, shoring up weakened sections, rebuilding what the day's bombardment had destroyed. It was exhausting work. The men dug and hauled and hammered through the night. Their hands blistered. Their backs ached. But they kept going because they had no choice. If the walls fell, the city fell. It was that simple. Giovanni Giustiniani organized the work with military precision. He divided the walls into sections and assigned teams to each. He made sure that the most damaged areas received attention first. He rotated the workers so that no one was pushed beyond endurance. He walked the walls himself, inspecting the repairs, encouraging the men, making sure nothing was overlooked. The Emperor was often there as well. Constantine did not stand apart from his people. He worked alongside them when he could. He carried timber. He filled baskets with rubble. He spoke to the men, learned their names, thanked them for their efforts. It mattered. The men saw their emperor with dirt on his hands and sweat on his face, and it gave them strength. The Ottomans did not limit themselves to bombardment. On April 7th, they launched their first assault. It was a probing attack, not a full-scale effort. Troops advanced toward the walls with ladders and grappling hooks. Archers provided covering fire. The goal was to test the defenses, to see how the defenders would respond, to identify weak points. The defenders responded with discipline. Archers on the walls fired down at the advancing troops. Stones and boiling water were dropped on anyone who reached the base of the walls. The few ladders that were raised were pushed away. The assault lasted less than an hour. The Ottomans withdrew, leaving their dead behind. It was a small victory for the defenders, but it came at a cost. Several men were killed by arrows. Others were wounded. The city's limited medical supplies were already being used, and everyone knew this was just the beginning. The real assaults would come later, when the walls were weaker, when the defenders were more exhausted. On April 9th, the Ottomans tried a different approach. They began digging trenches, moving them closer to the walls under cover of darkness. The trenches provided protection for their troops and allowed them to advance their cannon. It was slow work, but it was effective. Each night, the trenches crept a little closer. The defenders responded by sending out small raiding parties. Groups of men would slip out through postern gates in the darkness, cross the ditch, and attack the Ottoman trenches. These raids were dangerous. Many men did not return, but they disrupted the Ottoman work and bought time. The sea was quieter than the land. The Ottoman fleet blockaded the city, but they did not attack. The chain across the Golden Horn held firm. The Byzantine and Allied ships remained safe in the harbor. For now, the sea walls were not under serious threat, but the blockade was effective. No supplies could enter the city. No reinforcements could arrive. Constantinople was cut off, alone, surrounded by enemies on all sides. Inside the city, life continued in the shadow of the siege. Markets still opened, though the goods were fewer and more expensive. Churches held services. People tried to maintain routines. But the strain was visible. Faces were tense. Conversations were quieter. Everyone was waiting for something, for help to arrive, for the walls to break, for some sign of how this would end. Food rationing began in earnest. The authorities distributed grain from the public stores. Each household received a measured amount based on the number of people. It was enough to survive, but not enough to feel satisfied. Hunger was not yet a crisis, but it was present, a constant low-level discomfort that reminded everyone of their situation. By April 12th, the pattern was established. The Ottomans would bombard the walls by day. The defenders would repair them by night. Small assaults would test the defenses. Raids would disrupt the Ottoman work. It was a grinding, exhausting routine with no end in sight. The great cannon had fired dozens of times. The walls showed the damage. Cracks ran through sections that had stood unmarked for centuries. Towers leaned slightly. The outer wall in some places was more rubble than stone, but the walls still stood. The city still held. Mehmed was patient. He had expected this. He knew the walls would not fall in a week. He was prepared to continue the bombardment for as long as it took. He had supplies. He had men. He had time. The defenders had less of all three, but they had the walls. And, for now, that was enough. The great cannon cracked on April 14th. Not a small crack, but a split that ran the length of the barrel. It happened after the third shot of the day. The crew heard a sound like breaking ice, sharp and sudden. They stepped back quickly. Smoke poured from the crack. The barrel was still intact enough to hold together, but it could not be fired again without risking an explosion. Urban and his team examined the damage. The metal had been stressed beyond its limits. The repeated heating and cooling, the tremendous forces of each explosion, the sheer weight of the barrel, all of it had taken a toll. Urban said he could repair it, but it would take time. Days, perhaps a week. Mehmed was frustrated but not surprised. He had pushed the weapon hard. He ordered Urban to begin repairs immediately and to work day and night if necessary. In the meantime, the other cannon would continue the bombardment. The loss of the great cannon was a setback, but not a disaster. The smaller guns were still effective. They could not throw stones as large or as far, but they could still damage the walls. The bombardment continued without pause. For the defenders, the temporary silence of the great cannon was a small relief. That particular sound, the deep boom that shook the ground, had become the most dreaded. When it fired, everyone within earshot tensed. When it stopped, there was a collective exhale, even though dozens of other guns were still firing. The walls were showing serious damage now. The outer wall in several places had been reduced to rubble. The defenders had filled the gaps with earth and timber, creating makeshift barriers, but these were not as strong as stone. The inner wall was holding better, but cracks were appearing. Towers that had stood for 1,000 years were leaning. Mortar was crumbling. Every night the repair crews worked. They had developed a system. Teams would assess the damage at dusk, prioritize the worst sections, and divide the labor. Some men hauled rubble, others mixed mortar. Still others worked on the actual repairs, fitting stones, packing earth, bracing timber. The work was dangerous. The Ottomans sometimes fired at night, trying to disrupt the repairs. Arrows would come out of the darkness. Occasionally, a cannon would fire, the flash lighting up the night for a moment before the ball crashed into the wall or the ground nearby. Men were killed doing this work. Others were injured. But the work continued. The city was running low on certain materials. Timber was becoming scarce. The defenders had already used most of the available wood for repairs and fortifications. They began dismantling abandoned houses, pulling apart old ships in the harbor, anything to get more wood. Stone was less of a problem. There was plenty of rubble from the bombardment, but good timber was precious. Food was becoming a concern. Not a crisis yet, but the rations were tight. People were eating less than they were used to. The wealthy still had private stores, but the common people were feeling the pinch. There was no starvation, but there was hunger. Children asked for more food and were told to be patient. Adults went to bed with empty stomachs. The mood in the city was shifting. The initial determination was still there, but it was being worn down by exhaustion and uncertainty. People were tired. The constant noise, the lack of sleep, the physical labor, the fear, all of it was taking a toll. Tempers were shorter. Arguments broke out more easily. The social fabric was fraying at the edges. The churches remained full. People sought comfort in prayer and ritual. The priests spoke of faith and endurance. They reminded the congregation that God had protected the city before and would do so again. They spoke of miracles and divine intervention. Some people believed. Others went through the motions, finding comfort in the familiar words, even if they doubted the promises. there was still tension over the union with Rome. Some priests refused to acknowledge it. Some citizens refused to attend services where it was mentioned. But the arguments were quieter now. The immediate threat made theological disputes seem less urgent. People could disagree about doctrine and still work together to fill a breach in the wall. Constantine continued to walk the walls daily. He spoke to the soldiers and workers. He asked about their families. He thanked them for their service. He tried to be everywhere, to show that he was not hiding in the palace while others fought. It was exhausting, but he knew it mattered. Leadership in a siege was as much about presence as strategy. Justiniani was the practical counterpart to Constantine's symbolic leadership. He managed the day-to-day defense. He decided where to place men, which sections needed reinforcement, when to launch raids. He was tireless and efficient. The soldiers trusted him because he knew what he was doing, and because he shared their risks. He was often on the walls during bombardments, close enough to the action that he could be hit by the same arrows and stones that threatened his men. The Ottomans continued their methodical approach. The trenches crept closer. The bombardment continued. Small assaults tested different sections of the wall. Mehmed was gathering information, learning the defenders' patterns, identifying weaknesses. He was not in a hurry. He had the advantage of time and numbers. He could afford to be patient. On April 18th, the Ottomans launched a larger assault. It came at dawn, after a particularly heavy bombardment the previous day. Troops advanced in waves, carrying ladders and shields. Archers provided covering fire. The assault focused on the Mesoteikion, the section Mehmed had identified as weakest. The defenders were ready. They had seen the preparations. Giustiniani had concentrated his best troops at that section. When the Ottomans advanced, they were met with a storm of arrows, crossbow bolts, and stones. Men fell before they reached the walls. Those who made it to the base found the defenders dropping everything they could find: rocks, timber, pots of Greek fire, boiling water. A few ladders were raised. A few Ottoman soldiers climbed high enough to reach the top of the wall. They were met by defenders with swords and spears. Hand-to-hand fighting broke out on the ramparts. It was brutal and close. Men grappled and stabbed and pushed. Some fell from the walls, tumbling down to the ground below. The assault lasted 2 hours. Then the Ottomans withdrew. They left dozens of dead at the base of the walls. The defenders had losses too. Men killed by arrows, others wounded in the fighting. But the walls held. The city held. It was a victory, but it felt hollow. Everyone knew this was not the main assault. This was still testing, still probing. The real attack would come later, when the walls were weaker, when the defenders were more exhausted. After the assault, there was a brief period of quiet. The bombardment stopped for a few hours. The Ottomans regrouped. The defenders tended to their wounded and repaired the damage. People in the city heard about the fighting and felt a mixture of pride and fear. Pride that the walls had held, fear of what would come next. By April 20th, Urban had repaired the great cannon. It was not as strong as before, but it could fire again. The bombardment resumed with renewed intensity. The deep boom returned. The walls shook. The cracks grew wider. The waiting continued. Days blurred together. The routine of bombardment and repair became almost mechanical. People stopped thinking about the future. They focused on getting through each day, each night, each shift on the walls. There was no news from outside, no word of relief forces, no sign that help was coming. Constantinople was alone, holding on, waiting to see if endurance would be enough. The bread ration was reduced on April 22nd. It was not a dramatic cut, but it was noticeable. Each person now received slightly less than before. The announcement was made quietly, without ceremony. The officials who distributed the grain simply handed out smaller portions. People accepted them without complaint. What else could they do? Hunger was becoming a constant companion. Not starvation, not yet, but a persistent emptiness that never quite went away. People thought about food more than they used to. Conversations turned to memories of meals, of feasts, of times when there was enough. Children asked when they could eat more. Parents promised it would be soon, knowing they might be lying. The wealthy still had private stores. Their tables were not as full as before, but they were not going hungry. This created resentment. People noticed which houses still had smoke coming from cooking fires at all hours. They noticed which families still looked well fed. The social divisions that had always existed in the city became more visible, more painful. But there was also sharing. Neighbors helped neighbors. Families pooled resources. The churches organized distributions for the poorest. It was not enough to eliminate hunger, but it was enough to prevent despair. People took care of each other because that was what you did in a siege. You survived together or you did not survive at all. Water was not a problem. The city's cisterns were full. Beneath the streets, vast underground chambers held reserves that could last for months. The cisterns were ancient, built by emperors centuries ago who understood that water was life. Now their foresight was paying off. Whatever else ran short, there would be water. The markets still operated, but they were shadows of what they had been. The stalls were half empty. The goods that remained were expensive. A fish that would have cost a few coins before the siege now cost 10 times that. Grain, when it could be found, outside the official rations, was even more expensive. Only the wealthy could afford to supplement their rations from the market. Some people tried to maintain normal routines. Shopkeepers opened their shops, even if they had little to sell. Craftsmen worked at their trades. Teachers still taught children, though the lessons were often interrupted by the sound of cannon fire. These routines were a form of resistance, a way of saying that the siege had not broken them, that they were still living their lives. But normal was becoming harder to maintain. The constant noise wore on everyone. The bombardment started at dawn and continued until dusk. Even when you grew used to it, even when you learned to ignore it, it was always there in the background. Sleep was difficult. People woke at every loud sound. They lay in bed, listening to the distant booms and wondering if the next one would be closer. Children adapted better than adults in some ways. They played games that incorporated the siege. They built walls out of stones and knocked them down. They pretended to be soldiers. They made up songs about the cannons. It was their way of processing what was happening, of making sense of something too large to understand. But the children were also suffering. They were hungry. They were frightened by the noises. They sensed the tension in their parents. Some became quiet and withdrawn. Others became clingy, afraid to let their parents out of sight. The siege was stealing their childhood, replacing it with fear and uncertainty. The wounded were a growing problem. Every assault, every bombardment produced casualties. The city had physicians and healers, but their supplies were limited. Bandages were washed and reused. Medicines ran low. The most seriously wounded often died. not from their injuries but from infection or blood loss that could not be stopped. The dead were buried quickly. There was no time for elaborate funerals. Bodies were taken to churches, blessed by priests, and buried in mass graves. Families mourned privately. Public displays of grief were discouraged. The authorities wanted to maintain morale, and constant reminders of death did not help. Disease was a constant worry. In any siege, disease could kill more people than combat. The authorities enforced sanitation rules as best they could. Waste was collected and disposed of outside the walls when possible. Wells were monitored. But with so many people living in close quarters, with stress and hunger-weakening immune systems, illness was inevitable. So far, there had been no major outbreak. A few cases of fever, some stomach ailments, nothing catastrophic. But everyone knew it could change. One sick person could start an epidemic. The physicians watched carefully, isolating anyone who showed symptoms, trying to prevent the spread. The churches remained the heart of the city's spiritual life. Services were held multiple times a day. The Hagia Sophia was never empty. People came to pray, to light candles, to sit in silence. The building itself was a comfort. Its massive dome, its ancient mosaics, its sense of permanence. All of it reminded people that the city had survived before and might survive again. The priests walked a difficult line. They needed to provide hope without making promises they could not keep. They spoke of faith and divine protection, but they also acknowledged the reality of the situation. Some priests were better at this than others. Some offered genuine comfort. Others offered only empty platitudes that rang hollow. There were still arguments about the union with Rome. Some priests refused to mention it in their services. Some citizens refused to attend services where it was mentioned. But the arguments were quieter now, less heated. The immediate threat of the siege made theological disputes seem less important. People could disagree and still pray in the same church, still work together on the walls. Constantine attended services regularly. He prayed publicly, visibly. It was part of his role as emperor, but it was also personal. He was a man facing impossible odds, and he sought whatever comfort faith could provide. The people saw him kneeling in prayer and took strength from it. If the emperor could maintain faith, perhaps they could too. At night, when the bombardment stopped, the city became quieter. People gathered in their homes. They ate their small meals. They talked in low voices. They tried to rest. The darkness was a relief after the noise and chaos of the day. But the darkness also brought fear. In the dark, it was easier to imagine the worst. People lay awake thinking about what would happen if the walls fell. They thought about their families, their futures, their lives. Some prayed. Some cried quietly. Some simply stared at the ceiling and waited for dawn. The defenders on the walls had their own routines. They stood watch in shifts, looking out at the Ottoman camp. They saw the campfires, thousands of them, spreading across the landscape. They heard the distant sounds of the enemy camp, voices, horses, the clang of metal. They knew that, out there, men were preparing for the next assault. During the day, the defenders worked. They repaired damage, moved supplies, prepared defenses. During the night, they rested when they could, though rest was often interrupted by alarms or raids. They were exhausted, but they kept going. They had no choice. Giustiniani rotated his men carefully, making sure no one was pushed beyond endurance. He knew that exhausted soldiers made mistakes, that fatigue could be as dangerous as enemy action. He tried to give everyone at least a few hours of real rest each day. It was not enough, but it was what he could manage. The city was holding. The walls were damaged but standing. The people were hungry but not starving. Morale was low but not broken. It was a precarious balance, and everyone knew it could tip at any moment. But for now, life continued. People woke up each morning. They did their work. They ate their small meals. They prayed. They hoped. They endured. That was all they could do. Endure and wait and hope that somehow it would be enough. On the night of April 24th, the moon rose red. It was not a deep red, not the color of blood, but a dull copper tone that made people stop and stare. The moon climbed slowly above the horizon, tinted by dust or atmospheric conditions, looking wrong somehow. People who saw it felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. By morning, everyone in the city had heard about it. The red moon became a topic of conversation in the markets, on the walls, in the churches. Some said it was a sign from God. Others said it was a natural phenomenon, nothing more. But even those who claimed not to believe in omens felt uneasy. The priests were divided. Some saw the red moon as a warning, a call to greater faith and repentance. Others dismissed it as superstition, a distraction from the real work of defending the city. But they all had to address it because people were asking. People wanted to know what it meant. There was an old prophecy, half remembered, passed down through generations. It said that Constantinople would never fall while the moon was full. The moon had been full on the night it rose red. Some people took comfort in this. The prophecy was holding. The city would not fall. Others pointed out that prophecies were vague and could be interpreted many ways. The arguments went in circles. Constantine heard about the red moon and the unrest it was causing. He consulted with his advisors. They agreed that something needed to be said, some reassurance offered. The emperor addressed a gathering in the Hagia Sophia. He spoke calmly. He acknowledged that people were frightened. He said that signs in the sky were for God to interpret, not men. What mattered was faith and courage and the work they were doing every day on the walls. It was a good speech, measured and reasonable. It calmed some people, but others remained troubled. Omens had power because people believed in them, and in a siege, when the future was uncertain and fear was constant, people looked for meaning in everything. There were other signs, other portents. A statue of the Virgin Mary was carried in procession through the streets, as it had been in times of crisis for centuries. The procession was meant to invoke divine protection. But as the statue was being carried, it slipped from the hands of those bearing it and fell to the ground. No one was hurt, but the incident was seen as ominous. If even the Virgin's image could fall, what did that say about the city's fate? A few days later, a heavy fog rolled in from the sea. It was unseasonable, thick and cold. It lasted for 2 days, shrouding the city in gray. Visibility was reduced to a few feet. The bombardment continued, but the defenders could barely see the walls they were repairing. The fog felt oppressive, unnatural. When it finally lifted, people were relieved, but the memory of it lingered. These events fed into a growing sense of dread. The siege was entering its 3rd week. The walls were holding, but they were damaged. The food was running low. No help had arrived. And now there were signs in the sky and strange weather and accidents that felt like warnings. Faith became more important than ever. People prayed more frequently, more fervently. The churches were crowded at all hours. Candles burned constantly before icons. People made vows and promises to God. If the city was saved, they would donate to the church. They would fast. They would make pilgrimages. They bargained with the divine, offering whatever they could in exchange for deliverance. But there was also doubt. Quiet, private doubt that people did not speak aloud. If God was protecting the city, why was the siege continuing? Why were the walls cracking? Why had no relief force arrived? These questions had no good answers, so people pushed them away and prayed harder. The division over the union with Rome remained a source of tension. Some people believed that the union had angered God, that it was a betrayal of true faith. They said that the siege was punishment for this betrayal. Others argued that the union was necessary, that it was the price of survival, that God would understand. The arguments were bitter and personal. There was a group of monks who refused to acknowledge the union. They held their own services in a small monastery, separate from the official church. They attracted followers, people who shared their views. The authorities tolerated this because they had no choice. Forcing the issue would only create more division. But it was another crack in the city's unity, another source of weakness. Constantine tried to bridge these divisions. He attended both Orthodox and Catholic services. He spoke respectfully of both traditions. He emphasized what united them rather than what divided them. But he could not force people to agree. He could only try to keep the disagreements from tearing the city apart. Fear was everywhere, but it was not always visible. People hid their fear behind routines and work. They kept busy because being busy meant not thinking too much. They focused on immediate tasks, repairing a wall, cooking a meal, caring for a child. These small actions were a form of resistance against the overwhelming uncertainty. At night, fear was harder to hide. In the darkness, alone with their thoughts, people confronted what they had been avoiding all day. They thought about death. They thought about what would happen if the city fell. They thought about their families and whether they would survive. Some people cried. Some prayed. Some lay awake until exhaustion finally pulled them into uneasy sleep. The soldiers on the walls had their own fears. They feared being killed in the next assault. They feared being wounded and dying slowly. They feared failing in their duty. But they also had the comfort of action. They could do something. They could fight. For the civilians, there was only waiting and hoping and trying to survive. Children sensed the fear around them even when adults tried to hide it. They became quieter, more watchful. They clung to their parents. They had nightmares. Some stopped playing. Others played more frantically, as if trying to hold on to childhood before it slipped away entirely. There were moments of grace amid the fear. A neighbor sharing food. A stranger helping to carry water. A priest offering comfort to someone who was grieving. These small acts of kindness mattered. They reminded people that they were not alone, that humanity persisted even in the worst circumstances. Music helped. People sang in the churches, old hymns that had been sung for centuries. The melodies were familiar and comforting. Singing together created a sense of community, a feeling that they were all in this together. The words spoke of faith and hope and divine protection. Whether or not people fully believed them, the words themselves were soothing. Stories helped too. People told stories of past sieges that had been survived. of miracles that had saved the city before. They reminded each other that Constantinople had stood for over 1,000 years, that it had faced enemies before and prevailed. These stories might not change the present reality, but they provided a framework for hope. Giustiniani understood the importance of morale. He made sure his soldiers saw him regularly. He walked the walls, spoke to the men, listened to their concerns. He was honest about the challenges they faced, but also confident in their ability to meet them. His presence was steadying. The men trusted him, and that trust gave them courage. The emperor did the same. He was visible, accessible, human. He did not pretend that everything was fine. He acknowledged the difficulties. But he also expressed faith in the people, in their strength and resilience. He reminded them that they were defending not just a city, but a legacy, 1,000 years of history and culture. By the end of April, the city had settled into a kind of grim endurance. The initial shock of the siege had worn off. The fear remained, but it had become familiar. People had learned to live with it, to function despite it. They got up each morning. They did their work. They prayed. They hoped. The omens and signs continued to trouble some people, but others had stopped paying attention. What did it matter what the moon looked like or whether fog rolled in? The real question was whether the walls would hold and whether help would come. Everything else was just noise. Faith and fear coexisted. They were not opposites, but companions, two sides of the same experience. People believed and doubted simultaneously. They hoped and despaired. They prayed and wondered if anyone was listening. And through it all, the siege continued. The cannons fired. The walls cracked. The repairs were made. The cycle repeated. Day after day after day. May 22nd arrived with no change in the pattern. The bombardment continued. The walls cracked further. The repairs were made at night. The cycle had been repeating for 6 weeks now. People had stopped counting the days. Time had become a blur of noise and exhaustion and hunger. But something was different. The Ottoman preparations had intensified. The trenches were now very close to the walls. New siege equipment was being assembled. More troops were arriving. The defenders could see it all from the walls. Something was coming. Something final. Mehmed held a council with his commanders on May 23rd. The walls were as weak as they would get. The defenders were exhausted. It was time for the final assault. He set the date for May 29th, 6 days away. That would give his troops time to prepare and rest. He wanted them fresh for what would be the decisive battle. The plan was straightforward. A massive assault along the entire length of the land walls, with the main effort focused on the Mesoteikion. Wave after wave of troops would attack. The first waves would be expendable. Irregulars and volunteers who would exhaust the defenders and fill the ditches with their bodies if necessary. Then would come the regular infantry. Finally, the Janissaries would deliver the killing blow. The fleet would support the assault by attacking the sea walls. Even if they could not breach them, they would force the defenders to spread their forces thin. Every man defending the sea walls was one less man on the land walls. Mehmed addressed his army. He spoke of glory and plunder. He reminded them that Constantinople had never been taken by force, that they would be the ones to accomplish what generations had failed to do. He promised them 3 days of unrestricted looting if they succeeded, 3 days to take whatever they wanted from the richest city in the world. The soldiers cheered. They had been camped outside the walls for 7 weeks. They were ready to finish this. Inside Constantinople, the defenders sensed the change. The Ottoman camp was more active. The bombardment had become more intense. Scouts reported increased activity in the trenches. Giustiniani called a meeting with his commanders. They discussed what they knew and what they suspected. An assault was coming. A major one. Possibly the final one. Constantine was informed. He gathered his advisors. They reviewed the state of the defenses. The walls were badly damaged in several places. The outer wall was mostly rubble. The inner wall had cracks and weak points, but it was still standing. The question was whether it could withstand a determined assault. The food situation was critical. The rations had been reduced again. People were truly hungry now, not starving, but close. Another week, maybe 2, and starvation would begin. The city could not hold out much longer, even if the walls held. There was still no word of relief. No ships on the horizon, no army marching to help. Constantinople was alone. Constantine made a decision. He would address the people. He would tell them the truth. They deserved to know what they were facing. On May 27th, the emperor spoke in the Hagia Sophia. The church was packed. People stood shoulder to shoulder, filling every available space. The emperor stood before them, looking tired but composed. He told them that a major assault was coming. He told them that the walls were damaged and the defenders were few. He told them that no help was coming. He did not sugarcoat the situation. He did not offer false hope. But he also told them that they had a choice. They could surrender and Mehmed might show mercy. Or they could fight and die if necessary, defending their city and their faith. He said he had made his choice. He would fight. He would die on the walls if that was God's will. But he would not surrender. He asked them to make their own choice. Those who wanted to leave could try to slip out by sea. He would not stop them. But those who stayed would fight together, as Romans, as Christians, as people who refused to give up. The speech was met with silence at first. Then someone began to chant. Others joined in. Soon the entire church was filled with voices, pledging to fight, to defend the city, to stand with their emperor. It was a moment of unity that had been missing for weeks. The divisions over the union with Rome seemed to fade. The fear was still there, but it was joined by something else: determination, defiance, a refusal to go quietly. Constantine was moved. He had expected some to leave. He had expected doubt and fear. Instead, he saw courage. These people, hungry and exhausted and facing almost certain death, were choosing to fight. The next 2 days were spent in final preparations. The walls were inspected one more time. Weak points were reinforced as much as possible. Weapons were distributed. Every man who could hold a sword or a spear was given one. Women and children were told to stay in their homes, away from the walls. The churches held continuous services. People came to pray, to confess, to receive communion. The priests blessed the soldiers. They blessed the walls. They blessed the city. They did what they could to provide spiritual comfort in the face of physical danger. On the night of May 28th, the city was quiet. The bombardment had stopped. The Ottomans were resting, preparing for the assault. The defenders used the time to rest as well, though few could sleep. Giustiniani walked the walls one last time. He checked every section, spoke to every commander. He made sure everyone knew their position and their orders. He was calm and professional, but those who knew him well could see the tension in his face. He knew what was coming. Constantine spent the evening in prayer. He attended services at the Hagia Sophia. He prayed before the icons. He asked for strength and courage. He asked for protection for his people. He asked for a miracle, though he did not expect one. Later, he walked through the city. He visited the walls. He spoke to the soldiers. He thanked them. He told them he was proud to stand with them. Some of the men wept. Others stood straighter, drawing strength from his presence. The emperor returned to the palace late. He did not sleep. He sat in his chamber, looking out at the city. The moon was bright. The walls were visible in the pale light. Beyond them, the Ottoman camp was dark and quiet. Constantine thought about his life, his reign, his choices. He thought about the empire he had inherited, already dying, and his failed attempts to save it. He thought about the people who would die tomorrow because of decisions made long before he was born. He did not regret staying. He did not regret fighting. If the empire was going to end, it would end with dignity. It would end with its emperor on the walls, sword in hand, fighting alongside his people. As dawn approached on May 29th, the city began to stir. Soldiers took their positions. Civilians retreated to their homes. Priests said final prayers. Everyone waited. The sun rose slowly, casting long shadows across the walls. The Ottoman camp came to life. Drums began to beat. Horns sounded. The army began to move. The final assault was beginning. The evening of May 28th was unlike any other in the siege. The bombardment had stopped. After 7 weeks of constant noise, the silence felt strange, almost unnatural. People noticed it immediately. They stepped outside their homes and listened to the quiet. No cannon fire, no distant crashes. Just the normal sounds of the city. Footsteps, voices, the wind moving through empty streets. The Ottomans were resting. Their camp was unusually quiet. Campfires burned, but there was little movement. The soldiers were preparing themselves mentally and physically for what would come at dawn. Some prayed. Some sharpened weapons. Some wrote letters they hoped would reach their families. Most simply tried to rest. Inside Constantinople, rest was harder to find. Everyone knew what the silence meant. The calm before the storm. The final night before the final battle. Constantine spent the early evening making his rounds. He visited the walls one more time. He spoke to the commanders at each section. He thanked them for their service. He told them to be ready at dawn. His voice was steady, but those who looked closely could see the weight he carried. This was his city, his people, his responsibility. At the Mesotaikon, he found Giustiniani inspecting the defenses. The Genoese commander had positioned his best troops there. He had stockpiled weapons and supplies. He had done everything possible to prepare. The two men stood together on the wall, looking out at the Ottoman camp. They did not speak much. There was little left to say. They had discussed strategy and tactics endlessly over the past weeks. Now it was simply a matter of execution. They would fight. They would do their best. The outcome was in God's hands. Giustiniani asked if the emperor would stay on the walls during the assault. Constantine said yes. He would fight alongside his men. Giustiniani nodded. He had expected nothing less. As darkness fell, the emperor made his way to the Hagia Sophia. A final service was being held. The church was crowded with soldiers and civilians. People stood pressed together, holding candles that filled the space with flickering light. The service was solemn. The priests chanted ancient prayers. The congregation responded in voices that wavered between faith and fear. They sang hymns that had been sung in this church for centuries. The music rose toward the great dome, filling the space with sound. Constantine stood among his people, not apart from them. He was just another man seeking comfort in ritual and prayer. He knelt when they knelt. He crossed himself when they crossed themselves. He was their emperor, but tonight he was also their brother in fear and hope. When the service ended, people did not leave immediately. They lingered, reluctant to step back into the night, into the reality of what tomorrow would bring. They lit candles before icons. They whispered private prayers. They touched the walls of the church as if drawing strength from the ancient stones. Constantine stayed until the church was nearly empty. Then he walked slowly back toward the palace. The streets were dark and quiet. Most people were in their homes now, with their families, trying to find what comfort they could in each other's presence. In homes throughout the city, families gathered. Parents held their children. Husbands and wives sat close together. They spoke in low voices or not at all. Some prayed. Some simply sat in silence, listening to the quiet, knowing it would not last. Mothers tried to comfort children who sensed something was wrong. They told stories. They sang lullabies. They promised that everything would be all right, even though they did not believe it themselves. The children eventually fell asleep, exhausted by fear and the late hour. The adults remained awake, watching over them. On the walls, the soldiers settled into their positions. They would stay there through the night, ready for any surprise attack. They sat with their backs against the stone, weapons close at hand. Some talked quietly. Others sat alone with their thoughts. The veterans, men who had fought in other battles, tried to prepare the younger soldiers for what was coming. They spoke of staying calm, of following orders, of watching out for the men beside you. They did not speak of death, though everyone was thinking about it. Some soldiers wrote letters. They scratched words onto scraps of parchment by candlelight, knowing the letters might never be delivered but needing to write them anyway. They wrote to wives, to children, to parents. They said they were sorry. They said they loved them. They said goodbye. Others prayed. They knelt on the stone walkway and spoke to God. They asked for courage. They asked for strength. They asked to die well if they had to die. They asked for their families to be protected. They asked for mercy. The moon rose, bright and clear. It cast silver light across the city and the walls, and the Ottoman camp beyond. Everything was visible in the pale glow. The damaged walls, the enemy tents, the space between where tomorrow's battle would be fought. In the Ottoman camp, Mehmed was also awake. He stood outside his tent, looking at the walls. He had been planning this moment for years. He had gathered the army, built the weapons, organized the assault. Now it was finally here. Tomorrow he would either take the city or fail as his predecessors had failed. He felt confident, but not certain. The walls were damaged, but still standing. The defenders were few, but determined. Sieges were unpredictable. Things could go wrong. But he had done everything he could to ensure success. The rest was up to his soldiers and to fate. He thought about what would come after. If he took the city, he would be remembered forever. He would be the Sultan who conquered Constantinople, who ended the Byzantine Empire, who accomplished what seemed impossible. His name would be written in history, alongside the greatest conquerors. But if he failed, he would be just another sultan who tried and lost. His father had failed twice. Other sultans before him had failed. The walls had stood for 1,000 years. They might stand for another 1,000. He pushed the doubt away. He had prepared too well to fail. Tomorrow would be his day. Back in Constantinople, Constantine sat alone in his chamber. He had dismissed his attendants. He wanted these final hours to himself. He sat by the window, looking out at the city he had tried to save. He thought about his ancestors, the long line of emperors who had ruled from this city. He thought about the weight of that legacy, the burden of being the last. He thought about all the decisions that had led to this moment, decisions made by him and by emperors long dead. He did not regret his choices. He had done what he thought was right. He had tried to save the city through diplomacy, through appeals for help, through the union with Rome. When those efforts failed, he had chosen to fight. He would die fighting if necessary. That seemed fitting for the last Roman emperor. As midnight passed, the city grew quieter still. Even the soldiers on the walls were silent now, lost in their own thoughts. The only sounds were the wind and the distant barking of dogs and the occasional cry of a baby waking in the night. The hours crept toward dawn. The darkness began to thin at the edges. The stars faded. The moon set. The sky in the east turned from black to gray. On the walls, the soldiers stood and stretched stiff muscles. They checked their weapons one more time. They looked out at the Ottoman camp and saw movement. The enemy was waking. The army was forming up. The drums began to beat. Slow at first, then faster. The sound carried across the fields, across the walls, into the city. It was a sound everyone had been dreading and expecting. The sound of the final assault beginning. The last night of Constantinople was over. The last day had begun. The assault began before dawn. The drums beat faster. Horns blared across the Ottoman camp. Then came the sound that had become so familiar over the past 7 weeks, the roar of thousands of voices shouting at once. The first wave was advancing. They were irregulars, poorly armed volunteers, and conscripts from across the empire. Their job was simple and brutal. Advance toward the walls. Draw the defenders' fire. Exhaust them. Fill the ditches with bodies if necessary. They were expendable, and they knew it. They came in a mass, carrying ladders and shields, shouting to keep their courage up. The defenders on the walls watched them come. Giustiniani gave the order. Archers and crossbowmen began to fire. The Ottoman troops fell, but others kept coming. They reached the outer wall, what remained of it, and began to climb over the rubble. The defenders met them with swords and spears. Hand-to-hand fighting broke out along the wall. Men grappled and stabbed and pushed. Some fell from the walls. Others were cut down where they stood. The fighting was chaotic and brutal. The first wave lasted about 2 hours. Then the Ottomans pulled back, leaving their dead and wounded behind. The defenders had held, but they were already tired, and this was just the beginning. The second wave came almost immediately. These were regular infantry, better armed and better trained than the first wave. They advanced with more discipline, using shields to protect themselves from arrows. They brought more ladders, more equipment. They were determined to reach the top of the walls. The bombardment resumed. The Ottoman cannon, which had been silent during the night, opened fire again. They targeted the sections where the defenders were concentrated. Stone balls crashed into the walls and into the men defending them. The noise was overwhelming. Cannon fire, shouting, the clash of metal on metal, the screams of the wounded. Constantine was on the walls at the Mesoteakion, fighting alongside his men. He wore armor, but no crown, nothing to distinguish him from the soldiers around him. He fought with a sword, defending a breach in the wall. Those who saw him later said he fought bravely, calmly, as if he had accepted what was coming. Giustiniani was nearby, commanding the defense of the most critical section. He moved along the wall, directing troops, filling gaps, encouraging the men. He was everywhere at once, it seemed, always where the fighting was hardest. The second wave was pushed back, but barely. The defenders were exhausted now. They had been fighting for hours. Their arms ached. Their throats were raw from shouting. The wounded were being carried away, but there were not enough men to replace them. Then came the third wave, the Janissaries. They advanced in formation, disciplined and silent except for their war cry. They were the elite of the Ottoman army, and they looked it. Their armor gleamed. Their weapons were well made. They moved with confidence, knowing they were the best. The defenders saw them coming and felt their hearts sink. They had held off 2 waves, but they were spent. And now they faced the best troops the Ottomans had. The Janissaries reached the walls and began to climb. They were skilled and determined. They worked together, covering each other, pushing forward relentlessly. The defenders fought desperately, but they were being overwhelmed. At some point during this assault, disaster struck. Giustiniani was wounded. An arrow or a bullet, accounts differ, struck him in the chest. The wound was serious. He could not continue fighting. His men carried him away from the wall, intending to get him to safety. The loss of Giustiniani was catastrophic. He had been the heart of the defense, the one man everyone looked to for leadership. When he left the wall, the defenders' morale cracked. Some began to fall back, others fought on, but without coordination, without leadership. Constantine saw what was happening. He tried to rally the men. He shouted for them to hold. He fought harder, trying to inspire by example. But it was not enough. The line was breaking. The Janissaries found a small gate, the Kirkaporta, that had been left unlocked. Accounts vary on whether this was an accident or sabotage, but the result was the same. Ottoman troops poured through the gate, bypassing the main defenses. They were inside the walls. Once the Ottomans were inside, the defense collapsed. The defenders on the walls found themselves attacked from behind. Panic spread. Men began to flee, trying to reach the inner parts of the city. Some made it. Many did not. Constantine saw that the battle was lost. He could have tried to escape. He could have retreated to the harbor, tried to find a ship. Instead, he chose to die fighting. He tore off any insignia that marked him as emperor. He drew his sword and charged into the thickest part of the fighting. No one knows exactly how Constantine died. There are many accounts, all different. Some say he was cut down by Janissaries. Some say he was trampled in the chaos. Some say he removed his imperial regalia and died as a common soldier, his body never identified. What is certain is that he died on the walls, fighting to the end. With the emperor dead and the walls breached, the city's fate was sealed. Ottoman troops poured in through multiple breaches now. They spread through the streets, meeting scattered resistance but no organized defense. Some defenders fought to the death. Others surrendered. Still others tried to hide. The civilian population fled toward the harbor, hoping to find ships. The harbor was chaos. Thousands of people trying to board vessels that were already overloaded. Some ships managed to escape. Others were captured or sank from the weight of too many passengers. The Hagia Sophia became a refuge for those who could not reach the harbor. Thousands crowded inside, believing the church would protect them. They barred the doors and prayed, but the doors did not hold. Ottoman soldiers broke through and took everyone inside as captives. By midday, the fighting was over. The city had fallen. Ottoman flags flew from the walls and towers. Mehmed had achieved what he set out to do. Constantinople, the city that had stood for over 1,000 years, was his. The Sultan entered the city in the afternoon. He rode through the streets on horseback, surveying his conquest. He went to the Hagia Sophia and claimed it. He ordered it converted to a mosque. The great church that had been the heart of Orthodox Christianity for 9 centuries would now serve a different faith. Mehmed had promised his troops 3 days of plunder. They took him at his word. They looted homes and churches. They took whatever they could carry: gold, silver, artwork, books, anything of value. They took people as slaves. The streets were filled with soldiers carrying their spoils, with captives being led away, with the debris of a city being torn apart. But Mehmed also showed restraint in some ways. He stopped the looting after 1 day instead of 3. He protected some buildings and some people. He wanted Constantinople intact, not destroyed. He planned to make it his capital. He needed it functional. The Byzantine Empire ended on May 29, 1453. It had lasted for 1,123 years, from the founding of Constantinople in 330 to its fall in 1453. It had survived barbarian invasions, civil wars, plagues, and countless sieges. But it could not survive the combination of Ottoman determination and gunpowder artillery. The walls that had protected the city for 1,000 years had finally been breached. The empire that had preserved Roman law and Greek culture through the Middle Ages was gone. An era had ended. The sun set on a changed city. The fires from the day's fighting still burned in places. The streets were littered with bodies and debris. The survivors huddled in their homes or in captivity, trying to process what had happened. Constantinople had fallen. The world would never be quite the same. The morning of May 30th dawned on a city transformed. Constantinople was no longer Constantinople. It was becoming Istanbul, though that name would not be official for centuries. The Byzantine Empire was gone. What remained was a city under new rule, its people trying to understand what had happened and what would come next. The looting had stopped. Mehmed had ordered it ended after 1 day instead of the promised 3. He wanted the city intact. He had plans for it. It would become the capital of the Ottoman Empire, the jewel of his realm. Destroying it served no purpose. But the damage from that single day was extensive. Churches had been stripped of their treasures. Homes had been ransacked. Libraries had been looted, their books scattered or destroyed. Centuries of accumulated wealth and culture had been taken or ruined in hours. The human cost was harder to measure. Thousands had died in the final assault. The exact number is unknown. Estimates range from 4,000 to 50,000, depending on the source. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Bodies lay in the streets for days. The work of burial took weeks. Many more were taken as slaves. This was standard practice in medieval warfare. The victorious army had the right to enslave the conquered population. Tens of thousands of people were marched out of the city in chains. They would be sold in slave markets across the Ottoman Empire. Families were separated. Children were taken from parents. Lives were shattered, but not everyone was enslaved. Mehmed needed people to keep the city functioning. He allowed many residents to remain, particularly those with useful skills. Merchants, craftsmen, administrators. These people were valuable. He wanted them to stay and continue their work under Ottoman rule. He also showed mercy to some of the nobility. Those who surrendered were generally spared. Some were even given positions in the new administration. Mehmed understood that governing a city required cooperation from those who knew how it worked. The fate of Constantine's body was never definitively established. Some accounts say it was found among the dead and identified by the purple boots emperors wore. Others say it was never found, that Constantine died anonymously among the common soldiers. Mehmed supposedly ordered a search for the body, wanting to give the last emperor a proper burial, but whether the body found was truly Constantine's remains uncertain. What is certain is that the imperial line ended. Constantine had no children. His brothers were far away and powerless. The Byzantine Empire, which traced its lineage back to Augustus Caesar, had no successor. The continuity was broken. The Hagia Sophia was converted to a mosque within days. The Christian mosaics were covered with plaster. A mihrab was installed to indicate the direction of Mecca. A minbar was built for the imam. The building that had been the center of Orthodox Christianity for 900 years now served Islam. This conversion was symbolic as much as practical. It announced that the old order was gone and a new one had arrived. The city that had been the defender of Christendom was now part of the Islamic world. The change was profound and irreversible. Other churches met different fates. Some were converted to mosques. Others were allowed to remain as churches, serving the Christian population that remained. Mehmed was pragmatic about religion. He wanted his Christian subjects to be productive, and that meant allowing them some freedom of worship. The Genoese and Venetian communities faced difficult choices. Some had fought with the defenders and were killed or enslaved. Others had remained neutral and were allowed to stay. The Genoese colony in Galata, across the Golden Horn, had maintained its neutrality throughout the siege. Mehmed allowed it to continue operating, though under Ottoman oversight. The news of Constantinople's fall spread slowly across Europe. There were no telegraphs, no instant communication. Messengers carried the news by ship and horse. It took weeks for the information to reach Western Europe. When it did, the reaction was shock and grief. Constantinople had been a Christian city for over 1,000 years. It had been the eastern bulwark against Islamic expansion. Its fall meant that barrier was gone. The Ottoman Empire now controlled both sides of the Bosphorus, the gateway between Europe and Asia. The balance of power had shifted. There was also guilt. The Christian powers of Europe had done little to help Constantinople. They had sent token forces or nothing at all. They had made promises and broken them. Now the city had fallen, and they had to live with the knowledge that they might have prevented it. Some saw the fall as divine punishment. They said Constantinople had fallen because of its sins, because of the schism between Eastern and Orthodox churches, because of pride and corruption. These explanations were easier than admitting that military and political failures had led to the defeat. Others saw it as a wake-up call. If Constantinople could fall, what else might fall? The Ottoman Empire was powerful and expanding. It would not stop at Constantinople. Europe would need to organize, to unite, to defend itself. But unity proved difficult. The European powers continued to fight among themselves, even as the Ottoman threat grew. For the survivors, life went on in a strange new reality. Those who remained in the city had to adapt to Ottoman rule. They learned new laws, new customs, new ways of doing things. Some adapted well. Others struggled. Many simply tried to survive day by day, doing what they had always done but under different masters. The Greek population remained significant. Mehmed needed them, and he gave them a degree of autonomy. He appointed a new patriarch to lead the Orthodox Church. He allowed Greek schools and churches to operate. The Greek community would remain a vital part of the city for centuries, though always as a minority under Muslim rule. The city itself began to change. Mehmed started a building program. He repaired the walls and infrastructure. He built mosques and palaces. He encouraged Muslims to settle in the city, offering them abandoned houses and tax incentives. Slowly, the character of the city shifted from Christian to Muslim, from Byzantine to Ottoman. But traces of the old city remained. The walls still stood, damaged but intact. The Hagia Sophia still dominated the skyline, even with minarets added. The street plan remained largely unchanged. The cisterns still held water. The past was not erased but overlaid with a new present. Historians would debate for centuries what the fall of Constantinople meant. Some saw it as the end of the Middle Ages, the final closing of the ancient world. Others saw it as a beginning, the start of Ottoman dominance in the Eastern Mediterranean. Both views have merit. What is undeniable is that something significant ended on May 29, 1453. The Roman Empire, in its Byzantine form, ceased to exist. A political entity that had lasted for over a millennium was gone. The continuity from ancient Rome through Byzantium was broken. The cultural impact was equally significant. Byzantine scholars fled to the West, bringing with them manuscripts and knowledge. This influx of Greek learning contributed to the Renaissance. The fall of Constantinople helped spark a cultural rebirth in Europe, even as it marked a cultural death in the East. The military impact was immediate. The Ottoman Empire now controlled the straits between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Trade routes shifted. European powers had to find new ways to reach Asia, leading eventually to the Age of Exploration. Columbus sailed west looking for a route to the Indies, because the eastern route was now controlled by the Ottomans. For the people who lived through it, the fall was personal and immediate. It was the loss of homes and families. It was the end of a way of life. It was grief and fear and uncertainty about the future. The grand historical narratives came later. In the moment, it was simply survival. The Byzantine Empire was gone, but its legacy remained. Its laws influenced European legal systems. Its art influenced Renaissance painters. Its preservation of Greek and Roman texts shaped Western education. The empire fell, but what it had protected and nurtured lived on. Constantinople had fallen. The empire had ended. But the story was not over. It had simply entered a new chapter. The siege lasted 53 days, from April 6th to May 29th, 1453. 7 weeks and 4 days. In the long span of history, it was a brief moment, but for those who lived through it, each day was an eternity. We have walked through those days together. We have stood on the walls with the defenders. We have watched the cannons fire and the stones crack. We have felt the hunger and the fear and the exhaustion. We have seen the final assault and the fall of the city. Now, in the quiet after the story, we can reflect on what it meant. Constantinople fell because of many factors. The walls were old and could not withstand modern artillery. The defenders were too few. No help came from the Christian powers of Europe. The Ottoman Empire was at the height of its power, led by a determined young sultan who who had prepared meticulously for this moment. But beyond the military and political reasons, there is something else. Constantinople fell because empires do not last forever. Nothing lasts forever. The Byzantine Empire had endured for over 1,000 years, longer than most political entities in human history. But even that was not permanent. The people who defended the city knew this, at least on some level. They knew the odds were against them. They knew help was not coming. They knew the walls were cracking. But they fought anyway. Not because they believed they would win, but because it was the right thing to do. Because the city was worth defending. Because giving up was unthinkable. There is something admirable in that. Something human. The defenders of Constantinople were not heroes in the mythological sense. They were ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. They were tired and hungry and afraid. But they kept going. They did their duty. They stood their ground. Constantine XI died as he lived, doing what he believed was right. He could have fled. He could have negotiated a safe passage for himself. Instead, he chose to die with his city. History remembers him for that choice. The last Roman emperor, fighting to the end. Mehmed II achieved his goal. He took the city that had resisted conquest for 1,000 years. He ended the Byzantine Empire. He made Constantinople the capital of the Ottoman Empire. History remembers him as Mehmed the Conqueror. His achievement was real and significant. But conquest is not the whole story. What matters more in the long run is what came after. Mehmed did not destroy Constantinople. He rebuilt it. He made it a center of culture and learning. He allowed different religions to coexist. The city thrived under Ottoman rule, becoming one of the great cities of the world. The fall of Constantinople changed history. It shifted trade routes and sparked exploration. It brought Greek learning to the West and contributed to the Renaissance. It marked the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of a new era. These are the grand historical narratives, the big picture. But there is also the small picture, the individual lives that were changed or ended, the families that were separated, the homes that were lost, the grief and fear and uncertainty. History is made of these small stories as much as the grand ones. The Byzantine Empire is gone, but what it represented, the preservation of knowledge, the continuity of culture, the idea that civilization is worth defending, these things remain. They live on in the institutions and ideas that the empire influenced. They live on in the books that were saved and copied. They live on in the art and architecture that still stands. Constantinople itself still stands. It is Istanbul now, a city of millions, a bridge between Europe and Asia. The Hagia Sophia is still there, though it has changed forms many times. Church, mosque, museum, mosque again. The walls are still there, weathered and worn but standing. The city has survived empires and wars and centuries of change. If there is a lesson in this story, it might be about impermanence. Empires rise and fall. Cities change hands. What seems permanent is temporary. But that does not make the struggle meaningless. The defenders of Constantinople fought for something they believed in, even knowing they might lose. That fight mattered. It still matters. We tell these stories not to glorify war or conquest, but to remember. To honor the people who lived through these events. To understand how the past shaped the present. To recognize that history is not just dates and battles, but human beings making choices under pressure. The siege of Constantinople ended 573 years ago. Everyone who lived through it is long dead. The Byzantine Empire is gone. The Ottoman Empire that replaced it is also gone. But the story remains. It is passed down through generations, written in books, told in quiet voices on nights like this. And now you have heard it. You have spent these hours walking through those 53 days. You have seen the walls and the cannons and the people who defended and attacked them. You have witnessed the end of an empire. The story is over. The siege is done. The city has fallen and risen again in different forms. History has moved on, as it always does, but for a moment we remembered. We stood in that spring of 1453 and watched as the world changed. We honored the memory of those who lived through it, who fought and died and survived and adapted. That is what history is for. Not to judge or to glorify, but to remember, to bear witness, to acknowledge that these events happened, that these people lived, that their choices and struggles and sacrifices were real. The sun has set on the Byzantine Empire, but the memory remains, and as long as we remember, as long as we tell the story, something of that empire lives on. Rest well. The story is told. The siege is over. Constantinople has fallen, and the world has turned, and we are here, centuries later, remembering. That is enough.